All right. All right, welcome back, everybody. And I did start the recording. All right, let's see. All right. All right, anything before we jump into scenarios? All right. Okay, so scenarios. Seems like everybody thinks they're a good thing. Question is how many? And I guess the types of scenarios that should be conducted. Seems like folks kind of like the ones that were in the Brattle presentation, although they were just solely geared towards electrification, not necessarily including everything that we needed them to include. One thing the joint utilities indicated, he said you didn't want to consider 2031, but you were open to a one-off study. Jacob, Ethan, what do you guys mean by that?
Uh, 2031, Jacob, are you speaking? Or is that me echoing?
Go ahead, Ethan.
Go ahead. You first. You're on camera.
No. Take it, Ethan. Take it.
Okay. 2031 is already within our forecasting range, our 10-year forecasting. So, we would want to look out further than what we're already within. But, a one-off study for 2031, we would understand. Just we don't want to do too much study of something that's already within the range of our planning. That's all we meant there.
So it sounds like, Ethan, if you're willing to do a study that you typically wouldn't ordinarily do to consider 2031 in the goals of the CSNA. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, that is what you're hearing. But just, cognizant of the fact that this is already within our current planning cycle. Okay,
no, I get that completely. And I think that's at least what some folks want to see. At least I know, I think Mr. Ruchinsky and Mr. Bartlett, probably OPC are fans of that. Jacob, did you want to say anything, sir? No. Okay. Is it fair to say that PE and SMECO would be willing to do some kind of one-off study, assuming that your planning doesn't necessarily conform with that 2031 date?
Yeah, PE we would be.
All right, thank you, sir. Yes, sir, Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in a lot, but these were in very important stuff. So when Ethan says that the 2031 is within the 10-year plans that they already have, I think one of the important points about the 10-year plans that they already have is that they don't include the DERs, the EVs, and all the other things. And so I hope we're not saying that that we go all the way through the existing 10-year plans without doing anything different than we're already doing, because we have to in order to meet the 2031 goals. So a study of 2031 would be to show how those goals, which are enumerated, I think Mr. Cathan has listed them, and there are things like the 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but also 300,000 EVs and 1.5 gigawatts of storage online and so on and so forth. Those things are actually already there. And so I just want to make sure that we're not saying the 10-year plans stand as they are, and we're not going to do anything different until we get to the next planning cycle after that. And the 2031 study or scenario, whatever it is, would have to include how we respond to those CSNA and other targets that have been set.
Okay. Al, to your point, we are implementing EV and DER forecasting. It is in flight. that's one of the CSNA goals, as I understood it, and the JADE roadmap goals, was for us to be able to report on our process for implementing them. These goals, these aren't just going to happen suddenly. They are long-term IT projects that require a great deal of integration and study on our part. For one thing, we need to test out. Even when we are done with a forecasting tool, we don't immediately apply it. We check to make sure it's accurate and working properly. So, we won't. What I had understood the goal of this group was for us to have part of the outcome would be us reporting on how we are implementing the kind of changes needed to meet those CSNA and JADE roadmap goals. And, I feel that if we're going to be asked to just immediately do them in 2023 for 8 years out, we're not going to have very much success, because our technologies aren't there yet. We have different utilities on different time frames. We need to be cognizant of the fact that this is about moving us towards these goals, not immediately achieving them. We're going to be another year worth of rulemaking at least before these rules are implemented. So, we are still going to have these processes in flight and be trying to implement. There's no waving the wand here. This is very much going to be a slow, iterative process where we work to implement the kind of goals set forward. And that's why we need to have discussions about what bidirectional flows will mean on a distribution system, about hosting capacity, about, there are lots of areas we need to, and my capacity planner is jumping in here. I'm going to let him, as more of an expert, take the mic. Go ahead, Eric.
Eric, we can't hear you, sir.
Thanks. I keep hitting the lower button, the lower hand instead of the mic. Thanks for that, Judge McLean. Ethan, it wasn't intended for you to stop, but to piggyback after you're done. But you're raising some really good points to the question. And we're trying to be careful, but I see transparency is important here. We especially on the Exelon side, and Ethan spoke to these IT projects. They don't happen instantaneously, right? The Exelon companies are looking to deploy new forecast tools that can help us to be able to integrate DERs and all the things that we're talking about here. This is stuff that we started a year ago, and we've been through RFP process, and we're going through the implementation of the projects, but they take time. They do take time. So that's one of the things that we're looking to implement, to be able to be ready for the impact of the adoption of EVs, PVs, and things of that nature. To Ethan's point, also, there are different knobs that needs to be turned in the industry to really drive adoption, right? From both a legislative, regulatory, and incentive side, where we see a lot of goals or targets or milestones or laws out there to get to a certain point, but there are no incentives or anything that is being done from an industry or perspective to get us there. I'll give you an example, right? BG nor any of the PHI companies or any of the other utilities drives EV sales, right? Our systems enable EV, but we don't drive EV sales, right? And I've shared on this group before that, especially on the BG side, we've had a 99.9+ approvals of DERs that comes on our system. So, you know, we're enabling PV on our system. So in regards to things we are doing to prepare, we're deploying a new forecast tool that will help answer some of those questions. So we can integrate adoption of PV, integrate adoption of EV, and all of that will be driven from CSNA. We're looking at new tools to help control DERs, right, and help to prepare us for the storage goals that we have. Because if storage is going to be used, and we need to be able to manage storage to help mitigate capacity on the system, we've got to put some tools in place. So we have that going for us also, right? We have to revisit our standards on how we integrate these. We've been doing a lot of studies in the background, a lot of discussions on how we modify our standards to have that flexible system that we're talking about, right? So, you know, I share these to say, at the utility side, at least on the Exelon side, right, we are doing a lot to prepare. We are also paying attention to the milestones and timeline. I think we need to have a plan published, keep me honest, Judge McLean, somewhere in the middle and next, no, or is this on John's one of John's working groups? I'm on so many working groups, I get confused with them, right? But I think mid next year, we need to publish something of what we're doing from Jade Roadmap or from the electrification study, right? So there's a lot of things we're participating in all these working groups and preparing. We're looking at having our forecast system ready in 2025, somewhere 2026. We can't get it out any faster, right? And then be able to leverage those forecasts for the DSP to be able to share with stakeholders and things what we're seeing in adoptions in different areas. We've done some studies to help prepare us for these. We've done the E3 study. We've done the 1898 study that a lot of you are aware of, right? We're seeing studies being done in the electrification study working group. So there's a lot we are doing as utilities to prepare. Just wanted to be transparent with that a little bit. And to Ethan's point, it's not a flip of the switch of how we get there. These are huge IT projects that we need to deploy. I'll pause there. Hope that provided some clarity, some insight on what we're doing, and some transparency.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kathan?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, that was a lot of good information from both Ethan and from Eric on what is going on. And I appreciate the work that's being done by utilities to prepare. But that's what I'm hearing is preparing. What I would like to know, and I think this is part of just the process, is when will those the preparations start being reflected into the actual distribution system plans, into upgrades necessary? Is this going to be a reaction to EV deployment, or will there be actions taken prior, with an anticipation? So I think those are some of the questions I think are core to some of the questions that are coming from various people like Al and myself, just to try to understand what the process is and bringing it back to scenarios in what is incorporated in the business as usual. Is it an assumption of existing tools, existing processes, or does it reflect some reflection of meeting, or the state is meeting the goals in 2031 and 2045?
So, thank you, David. I just wanted to point out that we are limited in what we can do to prepare for policy goals, which is what I understood this work group to be talking about, is how we can change the rules, so that utilities, as much as anything, yes, how are utilities planning to meet these goals, but also what recommendations do we need to make as a group to allow utilities to prepare for state policy goals? Because, you know, I can't go to a rate case and say that I built out all of this, hosting capacity for DERs that we don't have forecasting for, that we don't have any, tangible reason to say it's coming, except a state goal that actually won't satisfy our regulatory rules right now. And so, we're looking for your help in getting the kind of information we need to make that a part of our planning on a regular basis and make that something that we can actually speak to. And, I understand that, and as far as preparation goes, these forecasting tools are exactly what we're doing to prepare for what comes with EV, what comes with, all of the DER integration that we're expecting. But right now, for instance, we're seeing market indicators that EV adoption is dropping. As Adam pointed out, from SMECO pointed out, these are things that how much do you want us to take those into account? And when we come to a rate case and say that's why we did it, is that going to be sufficient evidence? That's the question, with OPC in the room, I'd like for them to speak to. What would they be willing to support as far as incorporation into our forecasting? So really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks, Ethan. Eli, and then Al.
Yeah, I'm happy to try to respond directly to Ethan's question. I think what stakeholders can provide and what we believe would be appropriate in terms of scenarios here would be for one of the scenarios that should be considered, right? I think as a first step, we need to determine how many scenarios can reasonably be considered, and as the second step, what those scenarios entail, right? One is obviously going to be a base case, if you will, or perhaps that should be a business as usual case, but there need to be additional scenarios. And what I think we would argue is that one of those scenarios needs to explicitly incorporate the policy goals defined in the Climate Solutions Now Act and aggregate those from, what they basically from the long-term approach that they take. I think some of those goals, I forget what years they go out to. I think we highlighted 2031. I think some go out to 2045. But the idea of utilizing the CSNA goals as a starting point to say, let's develop a scenario that explores exactly what a distribution system plan looks like that can achieve those goals. And we understand that they are policy goals. They are not based on forecasts, so they are not necessarily likely to come to fruition, some more likely than others. But what we need to reflect is what a distribution system plan would look like that allows the state to achieve the goals that it has explicitly set out to achieve. And so one of those scenarios should basically be CSNA goals, then disaggregated into, a long, medium, and short-term approach that will allow the Maryland utilities to understand what distribution system upgrades are needed in order to basically achieve those goals. Ethan brought up an excellent point around ensuring reasonable cost recovery. And of course, we understand that, utilities should be provided cost recovery for what are deemed prudent investments. And so I think what this work group also needs to consider is what the actual distribution system planning approach looks like with regard to how you actually utilize different scenarios. Scenarios to some extent should be informative and provide, direction. It is not necessarily going to be the case that the utilities, because they've deployed the scenario, should then plan exactly to it, right? There might be components that this work group seeks to work together to determine what components of, let's call it just the CSNA case, if you will, right? The case designed to meet the CSNA goals, what components of that should be achieved through distribution system planning, and therefore what a reasonable path to cost recovery looks like, such that utilities can continue to recover costs for prudent expenditures. So that is clearly an element that this work group needs to consider. And so hopefully that was at least partially responsive to Ethan's question.
And thank you. And Eli, this is one of those moments where I feel like we're coming at things from your train leaving Washington, D.C. at 12:45. I'm leaving Chicago at 1:30. We're meeting in the middle, and this is exactly what we were trying to get to with the long-term analysis. So, yeah, I'm glad that we're beginning to come together in our thinking here, because that is exactly where we were going. This need to have these scenarios for course correction, for understanding where the markets are going, to inform our shorter term analysis, our shorter term planning. We need to see what the longer term movement of the state is in terms of those policy goals, which we didn't explicitly do want to incorporate into our long-term thinking, our long-term analysis. So appreciate that. Also appreciate your comment from 1241. So I think we're coming together nicely. This is a much more productive meeting than perhaps our last one.
All right. Jacob, do you want to weigh in? And then I'll go to Al.
Yeah, just real quick, Ethan had touched on a lot of that. I was going to kind of connect also back to the long-term analysis and the idea of having that policy scenario. Two other points, I guess, with that I would make is one, I know, the order and everything is around the CSNA goals, but I think something for us to think about is, if we're establishing, a long-term evolution of the distribution system planning processes, as I mentioned before, as we consider as goals evolve, what does that continue to look like? And not meaning that in a way of we aren't hitting the 2045 goal or anything like that, but more goals will be coming around, more established targets, and just making sure as we're framing in a way that is incorporating all goals that potentially come in. And second, I want to kind of make the point, we've thrown around terms of base case or business as usual. One thing with business as usual, I would lean towards base case, because I think business as usual, as Eric and Ethan pointed out, that business as usual is evolving, right? That's continuing to change as those abilities and technologies are evolving to be able to change those forecasts. And I think base case, in terms of just terminology, kind of just frames what that would look like more appropriately.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, thank you, Judge. So just a couple of points. One, first, to appreciate what Ethan, Eric, Jacob have been saying about what the utilities are doing. That's good. And when in phase one, we basically saw, I believe, except for PEPCO, that DER forecasting, for example, wasn't part of the process. And so that's one of the things that, we all want to make sure is included, and we'll get to that when we get to that block. But I wanted to address, just make the point that in response to what Eric said about, you got all these goals, but how are they going to happen? That this work on the distribution system is part of a multi-pronged effort that's underway. So right now there is an active working group that was established by the legislature that is includes actually a couple of senators participating, as well as industry and other people participating, that's looking at what incentives are needed to accelerate the distributed energy progress that we need, that exists under these goals, because we know that we're not on track to meet those goals unless we do more. So there is a separate process going on for that. There's the federal, in terms of incentives, there are probably no greater incentives than the federal monies that are available to both the state and to the utilities to accomplish the things that we agree need to be accomplished. And so, it's not that we have to solve it all within the DSP process, but the DSP has to be part of the process in order to, because it's the essential foundation for how the electricity moves around. So I just wanted to make that point. Also, there are some things, for example, that we'd like to hear about whether the utilities could just do. For example, looking critically at the 3 megawatt reserve capacity limitation that's imposed on 12 and 13 kV feeder lines, when actually that makes it impossible to build a 5 megawatt community solar project. And in other states, that has been looked at technically and has found that there's a lot more capacity on those lines potentially. And it needs to really be a line by line analysis, but it usually comes out to be between 8, 10, 12 megawatt potential capacity on those lines. The utilities could do that on their own. So there are some things that we're doing. The other question, Ethan was saying that right now, just having these goals won't meet their regulatory requirements for presenting rate cases and so on and so forth. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do with establishing what are the components of a distribution system planning process that need to be reflected in those rate cases and in the MRPs, so that there is the justification for the utilities to propose the capabilities we're talking about. So I think there are pieces in place that we're not paying attention to, but they actually, this process is part of a bigger process, but it's an essential part, and we need to get these things nailed down.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right. So going back to Eli's suggestion in terms of nailing down perhaps the number of scenarios, I don't want to say that everyone was on board with 3 scenarios, but it seemed like a majority of folks were. Anybody want to see more? All right. All right. So we agreed on 3. All right. So we've got a base or business as usual. Yep. A business as usual. And then Eli had suggested one second scenario that incorporates the goals of the CSNA. All right, Ethan likes that. All right, I'm taking silence as support. All right, in terms of a third scenario, Eli, what would you like to? Oh, Eric.
So thank you, Judge McLean. So when we speak of base scenario and one that takes into consideration CSNA, as I have conversations with others on the MEA side and things of that nature, I thought we as a state was moving towards the CSNA being the base scenario, because that is what we are supposed to be looking to achieve as a state. So hence why I'm just asking, right, why we are thinking of a base scenario different from a scenario that includes us seeing what the trajectory is to meet CSNA.
Just a guess. I think
You're more than a guess.
I'm guessing that the premise is to see what the goals would look like, what the utilities are doing now, what that would look like down the road, and then how the plans would change to meet the CSNA goals. That's my guess. Yes, Joyce.
I was the CSNA goals alone, the way I was envisioning this seems broad. I was thinking of being a little more granular with which ones we're talking about. It, kind of like there's different full electrification, certain amounts of heat pump, certain amounts of EV adoption. Maybe I'm thinking about it in a too granular way, but I was thinking more things phases. I hear an echo. I'm sorry if anyone else does.
No, it's all right. I don't think that's you're necessarily being too granular. I don't know if we necessarily need to be that specific at this time. Maybe we do. I don't know. I don't want to speak for everyone. Eli, were you, in terms of your base or business as usual scenario, what were you envisioning?
Yeah, my understanding of what a base scenario would most likely look like would be status quo. If this distribution planning work group were to not exist and utilities
don't
were
say
to
that. Don't say that.
Yeah, I'm not saying I wish it, to be very clear. But the idea of the base is, in theory, if the utilities were not modifying their distribution planning process whatsoever, what would be the scenario today, right? That was what I meant when I said base case. I understand where Eric is coming from in terms of incorporating CSNA goals into a base case. However, I think what would be important to see before, determining that is the reasonable approach, we would need to see what the impact is, right? If the utilities were to move today to an approach that reflects the CSNA goals instead of, the approach that they use to load forecast, et cetera, to develop their DSPs, that is going to come with a different set of costs, and it's going to come with a different set of annual plans. And so I think it would be very important to understand what the potential impact is, what the impact of those costs are, right? If Maryland suddenly, as of today, started planning its system towards the CSNA goals, in theory, I'm not saying it will because we need the data, but in theory, that could immediately double all the costs of the infrastructure needed to arrive at the CSNA goals on top of the status quo today, right? And that would be a very important data point to understand if costs were doubling or tripling, or theoretically, if they were halving, they're not going to be cut in half. But the point is that we would need to understand what the cost impact would look like of moving to that approach being the base or the standard case before being able to determine that is reasonable, right? If it immediately doubles, triples, quadruples costs, that's going to be untenable for ratepayers, obviously. And so, we need to think about what a reasonable approach looks like to get there. So I think as a starting point, it would be great to kind of understand what a DSP looks like medium, short, and long term in the status quo, what a DSP looks like short, medium, and long term in a CSNA case, if you will. And then understanding the delta between those two, which will give us some understanding as to, one, what that third case should look like, that hybrid case. And Ethan, I like that term hybrid. And it will, clarify what the delta is between what the status quo would result in and what a CSNA based scenario would result in. And I really think we need to understand that delta before determining that, yes, that should definitively be the base case going forward.
Right. And that's kind of what I thought you had intended. We got Ethan and then Eric.
Mine was a legacy hand. Eric, please go ahead.
So, Mr. I agree with most of the statement. It's just what we think is status quo today is no longer status quo, right? Not with the goals that Maryland is looking at, right? And in the next couple of years, when we and I think it's important for us to try and establish a little bit when we think we will be able to start even having some conversation around what the 10-year plan looks like, because I'm not sure if any of the utilities would be ready for 2024 to be sharing any of that or incorporating any of that information, right? It looks like something that may be out in 2025 or 2026. And I like to put stake in the sand because it helps us to visualize what the journey is going to look like, right? So incorporating some of the state goals in 2025, 2026, right? It's by that time our world will be a whole lot different, right? Where the status quo may be looking like what is a possibility that we may hit 20% of the state goals? What may be the possibility of us hitting 50% of the state goals? What's the possibility of us hitting 100% of the state goals, right? And the reason why I'm speaking to it in that terms is that as we are looking at the scenarios shouldn't be in terms of what is status quo. The scenario should be looking at what is the trajectory for us to meet the state goals? Because I get concerned when we talk about status quo as if the state has no goals at all, which is not real anymore. That environment is not real, right? It's going to be what percentage we're hitting that, right? So, you know, it's and maybe what the status quo is what is the trajectory of where we are with adoption, right? In regards to us meeting the state goals by a certain percentage, right? So just wanted to have some conversation around that, because I'm curious on our thoughts as we use the terms status quo, right? Because there's some realistic pieces to this too. I'll share, right? The realistic piece is, even if we're supposed to hit state goals in the next 10 years or so, and if our forecast and our plans shows that we need to build X amount of stations, if that's not realistic in the market we're in, then that is not a forecast where we can build a plan around. So we have to adjust where possible, right? So just wanted to have some conversation around that. And the reason why this is important to us here at BG is because these are when we sit in meetings and discuss things, these are some of the things that we debate on, and we try to see what is it we need to put in place to help answer some of the questions that our stakeholders would be looking for.
All right, thanks, sir. Adam?
Hey, Judge. Hey, I'm a little confused. How are these scenarios different than the ESWG scenarios that we're currently working on? And then who's developing the scenarios? Who's doing the study on the scenarios? And maybe I missed that part while I was eating my lunch earlier.
Oh, yeah, we all discussed it during lunch, and it's Smecco's taking the lead on all the scenarios for all the utilities.
Oh, see you next year.
Right. I mean, I'm assuming the utilities are doing this, the scenarios and the studies.
Yeah, I'm happy to share some thoughts. I think, so part one, how is it different from the electrification study? As I understand it, and I'll admit, was not in the electrification study work group, but saw the presentation last week and discussed it with others this week. My understanding is that that was focused just on electrification. And as Al listed in the chat just now, the CSNA dictates a handful of other goals that are incremental to what I would, characterize as just electrification goals. And so the idea of like a CSNA policy case is that, yes, it incorporates electrification goals that the electrification study does, but it also incorporates the other CSNA goals, namely the ones delineated by Al in the chat, assuming that's the full list. So you kind of work backwards from those goals. That's how it differs from the electrification one. Now, what I would recommend in terms of developing the scenarios is this work group is probably as well suited as anyone to work together to develop exactly what these scenarios should look like. And so I think it would probably come from collective discussion within this work group, and then a recommendation, ideally within the the April report to the commission, that they could direct the utilities to implement the scenarios deemed appropriate by the work group. And then it would be up to the utilities forecasting teams to actually implement those scenarios. Under any circumstance, the thought is that within this work group, we develop kind of detailed descriptions of the key assumptions that go into each of those scenarios. And that's how we would eventually arrive at them. There are potentially other paths to developing the scenarios themselves, but I think the scenarios would ideally be developed within the context of this work group. We would determine the key components to those scenarios, and then the utilities would go and implement. And to the extent there are, additional open items, perhaps the utilities could seek feedback from work group members about how to resolve any of those open items, or how to, what assumptions are appropriate, what inputs to the modeling are appropriate, etc.
So my follow-up question to that is then, are we looking at it as a system in total? Because I mean, the way I look at it, system planning, is I'm looking at my feeders, my tap lines, what infrastructure I need. Now we're looking at scenarios of how I'm going to reduce greenhouse gases on a tap line that is 60 years old. So I'm struggling again to match system planning and asset replacement with greenhouse gas reduction and how those two marry up. I mean, to me, I prefer, my thought process is, or at least from utility, is to see how this whole JADE process would work on our actual system plans. Create a scenario. Hey, we have a capacity issue here, we have aging infrastructure, and see how you stakeholders support and document those, how you can help us and assist us in those issues. I guess, so it seems like it's very blurry between, are we doing system planning or are we doing greenhouse gas reduction methodology? I understand greenhouse gases are important, but if we're talking about system planning, then it's hard to jive the two together on greenhouse gases, and I'm trying to just replace a wire that's bad underground.
The way that I view it is that we're doing system planning with one of the goals of that system plan to be to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets as identified in the CSNA. And so you basically, create, and I'm not a forecaster, but the utilities all certainly have forecasters. But the idea would be that you create a model that has a future end state, and that end state is optimized to achieve all of the CSNA goals. And then from that optimized end state, you back into annual distribution system upgrades that get us to a DSP framework where those CSNA goals can be achieved. And we probably need to talk directly with forecasting folks to understand exactly, from like a modeling perspective, how these types of goals can be incorporated into a modeling exercise.
I just want to note that I did put a pretty detailed example of a utilities load forecast and DER forecast into the comments. Portland General does both bottom up and bottom down, which might be worth taking a look at.
All right, Adam, does that help you at all?
I think I need more coffee, but I will think about it some more.
All right, thank you, sir. Samantha, then Jacob.
Yeah, thanks. So I think Eli just covered a lot of this, but I was going to try and speak to Adam's question a little bit. Again, I think the key thing that I keep getting tripped up on is what is a scenario? And the thing I keep having to remind myself of is that what we're talking about is the scenarios that affect what the DER and load forecast looks like. That's sort of the output of the exercise is, typically there's a high, medium, and low scenario. Let's say we can call it whatever we want. Maybe medium is meeting the CSNA goals. Maybe high is exceeding them. Maybe low is not achieving them. I'm just using those as easy examples. I'm not saying that's what I think the scenarios we use should be, but point being, in each of those scenarios, there's a different forecast that is sort of output of the model that you then plan to. So in other words, you know, you're looking out 5 or 10 years, and depending on what type of what role, for example, DERs play in GHG emissions reductions, or what type or what amount of electrification of load you're assuming, you know, that creates different grid needs. Meaning, you know, some areas may need a lot more capacity in a high growth scenario versus a low growth scenario. So that's how I see kind of the GHG emissions reduction and conversation and the DER integration conversation fitting in with forecasting and planning.
All right, thank you. Jacob.
Yeah, I had originally raised my hand also to kind of speak to one of Adam's questions, but Eli kind of answered in terms of regarding to the ESWG scenarios versus, I think we want to look more broadly at the, you know, the CSNA and you know, setting it up in a way that looks towards further goals. But I think Eli and Samantha both bring up, and Adam actually brought it up as well, around, you know, how do you translate these big broad goals into tangible, actionable data that utilities are able to incorporate into modeling and running that type of analysis, right? Being able to translate those things into data that can actually be used in those models, I think, is an important part of the conversation of what that actually looks like. And I think, you know, as we talked through a little bit with the straw, not to necessarily go back to that, but the idea of having some of those conversations with developers, with stakeholders to help drive some of that information is really critical as those assumptions get developed.
All right. Thank you, sir. Eric.
Thank you, Judge. I just want to piggyback on Jacob's comment that distribution planning is a bottoms-up analysis, right? It is not a system level looking at what the system load is, what the system DER is, and planning to that. It is a bottoms up. You have engineers that looks at what's happening on each feeder, what's happening at each transformer, a bus at the substation, what's happening in the substation and upstream if necessary, right? So I remind us of that as we are thinking through some of the recommendations that I'm hearing in regards to how we should be planning the system and how we should be incorporating data, because it is not as trivial as I'm hearing, right? It's making sure that we have data that has a certain level of confidence, so we can manage the upgrades on the system to meet the loads, to meet the DERs that needs to be there, and keep customer affordability in mind is essential in the planning process.
All right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, a good discussion. I mean, I think maybe the conclusion is that the process is both top down and bottom up, in the sense that I think, I made these suggestions in written comments. For example, an individual utility can't take responsibility for the whole system, but for planning purposes, for example, the target to have 14.5% of power generated from solar, each utility could basically apply that 14.5% to their own the amount of electricity that they actually are responsible for distributing, and use that as a planning target for things like numbers of electric vehicles. Again, for planning modeling purposes, they could either take their percentage of total customers in the state or their percentage of megawatt hours provided compared to the total consumption of electricity in the state, and use that as a basis for taking what share of that 300,000 would they want to plan on doing. So I think at that level, you're coming down from system level into utility service territory level, but that would be valid for planning. At the same time, what Eric says the engineering considerations and the cost considerations are important. And we'll get into some of those things when we get, for example, into hosting capacity, where hosting capacity is probably not going to be adequate, and therefore certain things need to happen. And we can talk about non-wire solutions. We can talk about the cost of new interconnection infrastructure. But that's where we kind of get to the bottom up part of it. But again, I think that will come as we work through the different components of JADE. Oh, and the final point I wanted to make, I put in the chat, we have to remember there's a lot of money on the table from the feds for exactly the kind of things that we are talking about. And we're hoping that both, and I think not just hoping, but expecting that both the state itself and the utilities will be focusing their applications for those funds to a substantial, I mean, obviously some of it's going to have to go into transmission as well, but to a certain extent, a lot of it is relevant to and available for the kind of distribution system modifications that we're talking about here.
All right. Thank you, sir. I'm not sure if we're starting to get too much into the weeds here or not. I don't want to stifle the discussion, but I also don't want to get bogged down. I mean, so I think everybody's agreed that we need scenarios. 3 seems to be a good number. Now, when I say 3, does that include, business as usual, base case, short, medium, long? Is that considered 1, or is that considered 3 scenarios?
Judge, would you repeat that? Sorry.
Right. Well, we're talking about scenarios, and I believe you had referenced for the base case or business as usual, kind of a short-term, medium-term, and long-term approach. And then for the second one, you had a short, medium, long in terms of the CSNA goals. And then I wasn't entirely clear on your hybrid. But I guess my question for the utilities is, do they consider the short, medium, and long to be separate scenarios? Or is that are we still talking about one scenario?
As far as the EU utilities go, we see long and short, or long, medium, or I'm sorry, short and medium is something we already do and not something we could really incorporate policy goals into. We can incorporate tactics and plans in the distribution system plan. As far as scenario forecasting analysis goes, we would do 3 scenarios probably in a long-term look, because we would need time to adjust. And want to understand where the trends are moving. The shorter term ones we would have to take back and think about more. That's a little bit of maybe we need to have some conversations with other parties or what they mean by short and medium term forecast scenarios.
Did I phrase that? Well, Eli popped on. I'll let him correct.
Yeah, I think we're now talking about 2 distinct things, and I just don't think we want to combine them, right? In terms of scenarios, what I was speaking to was 3 scenarios. 1 is a base case, status quo. 2 is CSNA case. So, literally what does the distribution system plan need to look like in order to achieve the goals delineated in the CSNA? And then 3, some type of hybrid, potentially somewhere between the CSNA and the status quo. I will caveat, we're certainly not married to these 3 being the definitive 3. I think Samantha from CCSA brought up some alternatives, certainly open to exploring those alternatives. However, what I was getting at when I mentioned the short, medium, and long term, and I don't want to confuse, I'm trying not to confuse the discussion, is that each of those 3 scenarios should each of those scenarios would have a short, medium, and long term only, and we're not saying 3 distinct scenarios within this scenario, but the idea that if you take the base case scenario, as we talked about today, utilities have some, and Ethan just mentioned, a long term and a short term today, right? And the short term, I have to assume, to some extent at least, flows from the long term, right? They're not saying different things. And so all I'm getting at when I'm saying short, medium, and long term, they're flowing from the same endpoint, right? If you theoretically extrapolated the short term to the medium term, it would be the same as the medium term. If you extrapolate it to the long term, it would be the same as the long term. So we're not saying three distinct like paths in terms of short, medium, and long, but that they just kind of all flow from the same endpoint. And those three endpoints are base case, CSNA case, hybrid case. And that's hopefully that adds some clarity and not more confusion than there was before.
All right, well, it might have been I apologize if I'm adding to the confusion. Ethan, does that help?
We may want to have an offline conversation with Eli at this point. I think this is going to take a little bit more than a couple of sentences back and forth.
Okay, all right, very well. Couple hands up, DeAndre and then Dave.
Thank you, Judge McLean, and good afternoon, everyone. Please excuse me, I'm feeling a little under the weather, so please, I hope you'll have some patience. But my first question is, or my first statement is about the business as usual case. Maybe I need some more understanding of business as usual case, but at this point, I don't think a business as usual case would be advantageous for us to include as a scenario, because I think it's pretty clear that, I mean, these goals, the CSNA goals and other goals that have been set have clearly shown that we're not moving in the direction that we need to move in at this moment in a business as usual situation. So obviously there needs to be some change and needs to be some things that need to be done in order to reach some of these clean energy goals or to get to where the state wants to be. So a business as usual, clearly it's not going to get us there. I think as a base, and these might be two separate ideas, these might be separate. I think we can only affect what we can control. And in this situation, the utilities have control of their very own operations. So, for instance, if utilities would take an approach as to turning green, that would be the situation that they can control by looking at their own operations and how they can ultimately, for lack of better words, turn green, meaning they can use more, incorporate more clean energy in their operations and how they just their services, programs, existing programs that they have now. Those are things that utilities can control. And looking at that, how much of a GHG reduction, emissions reduction, how much of an effect, or how much closer does it get us, or what type of difference does that make in order for us to reach the goals that we're trying to reach? Getting a snapshot of that outside of including any uncertain forecasts, I think can be a base. Once we start incorporating, or we get a better understanding as to what type of forecast or more accurate forecast we can incorporate into some of these scenarios, then I think that will get the wheels turning in regards to the scenarios, or how we think what is a little bit more certain future that we can be more confident about. In another case, I think the target should be the CSNA goals that we have that are set in policy and should be tapered back. For instance, there's a certain percentage, there's a certain goal that's set for 2045. Our forecasts or scenarios can be based on a percentage of those existing targets. So, let's say if we're supposed to be 60% by 2045, what would it look like if we were? How will we get to 30%? How will we get to 45% to then build up to 60%? I think that could be a scenario in which we can use as a base, like because there's still an opportunity to advise or provide feedback to the General Assembly as to if these goals are feasible that have been set. I don't know if I made that clear or made things clear or whatever, but that's basically my overall comment.
All right. Thank you, sir. We got a couple hands up. We got Dave and then Mr. Regal and then Jacob.
Yeah, I do agree with Eli. I think the planning horizon discussion on short, medium, and long is a completely separate thing than the scenarios. Each scenario could have its own, short, medium, and long. I do agree with that. As far as the scenarios go, commenting to DeAndre, I think it's important to have a scenario that takes all the goals into account, but we also need to be aware of reality. And if reality is exceeding those goals or falling short, we have to consider that. We don't necessarily want to spend capital on goals if they're not becoming reality. We need to have plans in place to make that happen. But we can't just turn a blind eye to reality. We have to keep a finger on that. And spend capital wisely and keep an eye on how things are progressing with the goals. I just think that's an important data point that we need to keep in mind.
Right. And at least, again, my understanding of the purpose of the base or business as usual is to kind of see how we are now in terms of what the utilities are doing to meet and how they would meet those goals just based on what we're doing. So if it's 60 by 31, business as usual says we get there by 15%. It at least gives you the delta in terms of potential cost of what the utilities would have to do to make up that gap. Did I get that correct or close?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
I was just trying to to have a system that's planned to state goals. If in the future that isn't the case and our system falls apart,
sure,
we can't sit there and say, oh, it's not meeting demand, but we planned it according to state goals.
Right. No, I'm with you. I'm with you. All right, Mr. Regal.
Yes, Judge. Thank you. Hey, I think the light bulb finally went off for me, and I think a clear distinction for the work group to consider is when I think about system planning. I'm generally thinking about our 3-year capital work plan, our 12-year electric system plan that is really geared towards reliability. And those typical traditional utility plans are looking at things that we had mentioned earlier, aging infrastructure, voltage profiles, thermal loading, operational flexibility, capacity needs, new services, etc. That's quite different and sometimes maybe potentially in conflict with system planning as it relates to the context of what this work group is trying to accomplish. So system planning from a perspective of this planning work group is looking more towards the state goals that are looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, looking at local area needs for addressing electrification, future what if type scenarios. And I'm just not sure that the system planning from the work group perspective necessarily meshes very well with our traditional system plans looking at reliability. At the end of the day, we're obligated to meet the COMAR reliability standards, and that is really where a lot of the time, effort, and resources focuses. And I think we just need to be careful and make sure we understand a clear, distinct difference between traditional system plans that the utility may think of versus a system plan that this work group is contemplating. Thank
Sure.
you.
Understood. And I think we're going to get into, I know you mentioned reliability. That's like in block 2, that's assuming we get there at some point, that's one of the goals. It's as used as an example, but go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, I kind of want to push back a little bit on that last point. I think that explanation kind of bifurcates two processes that I think this work group actually is set out specifically to create one process and only have one process. As you mentioned, I think it's Herb, the way that traditional utility distribution system plans are built out today is to accommodate the system for reliability. That is the driver. And I think part of the whole impetus of this work group is recognizing that we are no longer in a reality where reliability is the sole driver. There are other drivers. No doubt that it is still the utility's primary responsibility to plan the system towards adequate reliability. Absolutely, no doubt about that. The idea is that now the utility also needs to plan their system in accordance with environmental goals and GHG reduction goals. And these also need to be factored in as endpoints of the DSP process. So the DSP needs to evolve from solving for reliability being really the sole goal of making sure we have a good distribution system to being reliability plus GHG reduction plus state mandated DER deployment targets plus all of these other elements that are driven by state policy priorities. And so I just want to reiterate that I don't think it's this work group's direction to come up with a distinct distribution system planning process that does not target reliability. The idea is to figure out how to target reliability and all of these other things. And that's the exact purpose of this work group.
Yeah, I get it, Eli. I'm just simply trying to point out that those two objectives may not always mesh well together. There may be some differences and some conflicts between those two objectives. I'm just trying to make a clear distinction that this work group understands it.
All right, Jacob.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. One, in terms of reliability, obviously, I think reliability is goal number one, no matter what with the system. And obviously, we're talking a lot here about capacity and load growth on the system and forecasting generation as well on the system and what that looks like and what it takes to incorporate it. And kind of going to some of the points Dave made, as well as DeAndre brought up regarding the base case. I think it's important to kind of frame the base case as kind of what we're actually seeing, right? And what we're actually seeing happen and expecting to happen within the system. And to Dave's point, that may be exceeding the goals, that may not be exceeding the goals, but right, having that balance of what we're actually seeing. And I think that is an important forecast to differentiate from planning for the goals, because as Al, I believe you made the point of there's a lot of macro factors that play into meeting these goals, incentives in other areas, all those kind of pieces. So I think it's important to understand what that delta may potentially be when looking at these different scenarios of does the business as usual align or not align with that policy CSNA goal scenario. And I think it's important, not just for the utilities, but for the stakeholders as well to understand, how are we doing against, working towards implementing those goals, and what are some of those other, factors that may need to be considered in that space. So I do think having that business as usual or a base case that is looking at just what we're seeing and what we're actually forecasting based off of what we're seeing, I think is a beneficial scenario to have.
All right. It sounds like we're maybe in the right church, but a different pew. Ethan, you said you want to maybe have a offline conversation with Ethan.
I think Damon actually clarified Eli's point, and we're good there. So let's keep this train rolling.
Well, are we rolling? Well, all right. So can you just all right, so can you for the benefit of the group and probably more myself, where are you now? So do you agree with Eli?
We agreed that with a 3 scenarios sounds like a good idea. Base case, policy, and hybrid, and that this could be looked at from a short, medium, and long-term planning perspective, we wouldn't want to end up doing 9 total scenarios. It's just if that Damon, I understood Damon to understand it as planning for short, medium, and long term based on 3 scenario results. That was what I got.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just making sure. Okay, and Eli agrees with you. All right. Okay.
I think that was pretty well characterized. Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right.
High five, Eli.
And again, I apologize if I'm muddying the waters. Eric.
Yes, if I may, I work with a team that actually has to do the work, right? So just wanted to get some clarification and ask some inquiring questions. What is it from a DSP perspective would we expect to learn or see looking at a short, mid, and long-term plan, right, versus just one that incorporates all the different data set? Because I'm struggling with that piece, right? I'm hearing that there are 3 different durations we're looking at. Just curious, what's the benefit of looking at 3 different durations?
I think part of the benefit is understanding to what extent the system upgrades, the plan system upgrades, are likely to achieve the targets dictated by the CSNA in the short, medium, and long term. Helps us understand how far off, the state is from achieving its mandated goals.
As and I'm asking these questions because just things that I've seen from our studies that we've performed so far. So we've performed studies that takes us up to at least I can't remember if it's 42 or something of that nature, and one of them is looking at where we are at 31 versus the longer term. And wouldn't it be possible, right, just to speak to what are the projections over, say if we're looking 10 years out, for lack of a better word, and say what the different projections are over the 10 years, and breaking it down in regards to what we would see, say, in year 5 versus year 10, something of that nature. I'm not sure what a 1 year would buy this group at all. Having a discussion with this group from a 1 year look ahead, because those are operational solutions we're looking at if we're within a 1 year. So I'm struggling from a DSP perspective. If we're looking out 5 years, right, or 10 years, right, as we get closer and move through the years, what's the benefit of a short term to this group?
Eric, this is Herb from SMECO. I'd like to follow up on that as well. I mean, you're exactly right. Or short term, like in our case, our 3-year capital work plan, it's already being implemented as we speak.
Right.
It takes SMECO as a cooperative pretty much the entire year to create a long-term plan. In our case, 12 years. I mean, I think a lot of these new state goal system planning metrics really would be better spent looking out the next 5 to 10 years, because there's no physical, practical way they can be implemented in the short duration, because it's going to take us a year just to study these things and try to evolve them. So I tend to agree with you.
Thanks, Herb. Appreciate that. I'd like to hear from the other stakeholders too. What would be that benefit to look at what's happening that close?
Well, one of the CSNA goals, if I recall correctly, has to do with increased stakeholder transparency into the distribution system planning process. And so, as you both discussed, the utilities already do this. They already, have developed these plans internally. And so I think for transparency's sake, as the CSNA requires, providing those short, medium, and long-term plans and understanding how those align with achieving the CSNA goals or don't is exactly what the CSNA calls for and would be one of the benefits with publicly sharing these, distribution system plans that already exist.
Eli, I would go back to a previous comment. There's two distinct system plans. The system plan that we have in place now is targeted at reliability. This working group is now giving us a new set of objectives to plan for, and they don't necessarily exist in definite detail and specifics within existing long-range plans. I think it's going to take 12 months at least to try to put such a plan together to adequately address what I think this work group is trying to achieve with a different set of objectives here.
I think that's right. And I think that's why we're here. And so the goal is to move on, move from a distribution planning approach that does only focus on reliability to focus on reliability plus. And David had what I felt was a very helpful comment in the chat about, this also needs to reflect maintaining reliability, but addressing electrification, addressing DER outcomes, and the other CSNA goals as dictated by the state.
May I ask I know I've looked over CSNA a few times, right? And I may have missed that piece, right? The piece that states transparency down, at a yearly level. I'm just trying to have a conversation, right, in regards to some of the comments and in regards to what CSNA, they ask from CSNA from a distribution system plan. I may have missed that piece, right? I thought we were here, right? Distribution system plan is separate from CSNA, right? CSNA came after distribution system plan, to my understanding, right? So we are looking to incorporate CSNA into DSP. That's if I'm totally misunderstanding that, I'd like to have a conversation.
I just want to jump in real quick. I feel like we've kind of gone a little astray and down a rabbit hole.
Just a little?
Recognizing the time, I think it'd be good to shift back to just focusing on the scenarios and continuing to work through that discussion.
All right. I don't disagree. And again, it seems like everybody's okay with 3. Sounds like most folks are okay with business as usual / base rate. Or base case. We can fight about what the actual best term is later. Then one with the CSNA goals, and then some kind of a hybrid. I'll just call it a 50%. If we meet 50% of the CSNA goals. All right. I think that's probably the best we're going to do in terms of what we need to accomplish today, just knowing that those are the types of scenarios that we're looking at. Anybody else agree, disagree? We'll get into reliability and goals and stuff like that next meeting.
Agreed.
I think that's a good framework moving forward. Thanks, Judge.
I agree.
All right. Excellent. And appreciate you getting us back on the rails there, Jacob. And again, people think we're getting into the weeds. Just yell out, because I want to make progress, but I also don't want to unnecessarily cut discussion short. All right, next block. Data sources, scope, and access. Kind of all over the place on this one. Some of the questions in the comments related to AMI. For the folks that have AMI, are you guys actually using that information in your forecasting and planning now?
Yes, we use AMI and compare it to SCADA data. And let's just be aware that there is a ton of data.
Chuck Smecco uses AMI data for 20-year system load forecasts. It's used in a more limited fashion for our local system planning and distribution system modeling.
Thank you, sir.
And Potomac Edison does not have AMI data.
Are you guys going to have it by maybe next year?
No, we don't have current plans for it.
I know, I'm just teasing you. Jacob, what about PHI?
Yeah, PHI uses AMI and SCADA data similar to what Ethan mentioned for BG.
Okay, awesome. Does that at least hopefully put some of the stakeholders at ease? Okay, Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's good to hear that folks are using this. I thought that maybe it was David Cathan raised a question about, somebody raised a question about some aspects of AMI data that is potentially available but not being used. And could people speak to that, whether they're David or others, whether there are additional components of AMI data that might be useful that are not presently being used in planning but could be?
Since I'm being referenced there, I guess the question goes back to the utilities in the sense. I hear you saying that AMI is being used along with SCADA in planning. I would just be curious, and I don't want to drag us into a total, black hole and more into the weeds. But how is it used? Is it used at the granular feeder level? Or is it used more for, in total for forecasting of load in general?
It's used for forecasting load at the feeder and substation, transformer, and substation level. That's how we verify the actual loads. And then some utilities, and I don't want to speak for everyone, are moving to 8760 data regarding that.
Go ahead, Jorge.
So Ethan, you mentioned something interesting. You said maybe that just mean a subset of what you're doing with the AMI. You said that you use it to bet the SCADA data, or are you using other functionalities of the meter? Or is it just a way to bet what you're getting from SCADA? For example, and let me be straight out. I mean, at a feeder level, are you capturing on a timestamp basis current flows, voltage profiles? You can get power quality information in regards to voltage sags. So what is exactly that you're pulling from the meter?
I was just speaking to load forecasting. I can't really speak to the rest of the engineering uses for AMI data. I'm sorry.
So in regards to the timestamp, okay, so are you looking into the timestamp data at a feeder level discretely to inform your forecast, or are you just, it caught my attention that you said you're using it to bet SCADA, but I may have got that wrong.
That's a statement that I've known is true for 4 years now. I can't really speak more to it. It's just that's what it's used to verify. You have two sets of data. You make sure that they agree.
Okay, so all right. So what about the feeder level? The ability to look at historical.
Okay, Jorge, I'm really the wrong person to ask this.
Okay.
I honestly, I'm an economist.
I think from a distribution system planning perspective and AMI data, I believe that was talked through and on the record for phase one. I believe that was a topic, right? So I think there's that information out there.
Okay, so just to get to the bottom line, Jacob, are you able to look at historicals on an hourly basis, timestamp 8760, so that can inform your projected low forecast?
Like I said, I'm pretty sure that was presented in phase one, so I would just refer you back. I know in one of our previous send outs, we had sent out the slides that were presented as part of the phase one report. So I believe that's all in there.
So you don't recall?
I don't recall at this moment.
Okay.
All right. I mean, this is an area, it looked like there was a lot of disagreement. I think the utilities were asking the stakeholders to provide a list of information of what they thought the stakeholders needed, and the utilities would see if they had it and if they could produce it. OPC was looking for the establishment of a platform, some kind of a data platform, opportunities to peer review solutions that were presented by the utilities. I'm assuming that there's been probably no movement on the utilities from at least the data platform.
No, I think the same concerns exist for the data platform.
Right.
Wait, could you reiterate the concerns just in some, not a detailed explanation, but if I recall correctly, they were mostly around cybersecurity. Is that right?
But I recall cyber and legal concerns were just the two that were expressed.
And physical security. We've got CEI, customer data, proprietary data, contracts with software contracts, and that's why talking about the term data, why we ask people to come forward with what they're interested in discussing, and we can respond to it more exactly. The term data covers so much in our world that, if we can talk about what specifically you're looking for, that makes it easier. And just the idea of an online portal is that I wouldn't look forward to having that conversation with my cybersecurity team if we were to go that direction. So I hope you won't put me there. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that the Illinois Commission recently ordered ComEd to work to create a data platform in Illinois, which I believe is an Exelon subsidiary.
And this is Maryland.
I think you're right. Mr. Bartlett.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Even do any of the rules or security concerns different in Maryland?
Well, I've got the NSA on my system, so.
You've got what?
The NSA.
And they don't in Illinois?
We got you, Ethan. I mean, and they got our Argonne National Labs. Listen, I think we hear you. You don't want to talk to your cybersecurity people, but I think we got to the point that we may need to start having those discussions because they may be there are things already in the distribution system that are plain to the eye. So we just want to make sure that we're reasonable with what it is that we're restricting. Listen,
I'm willing to have the conversation. I'm just, warning people that we have customers that have significant influence. And,
in my previous life, I come from one of those three acronyms. So I totally understand it. But at the same time, I can see it here in the District of Columbia in Maryland that these things are on plain sight. But so what we're looking for is what is reasonable to protect, and there may be many reasons to protect, and what it is not reasonable to protect to allow transparency to the process.
And, that's the conversation. Again, goes back to the data ask we've made. Let us know exactly what, and we can respond more exactly. The platform is not something that, I see us having a lot of comfort with. We prefer, for instance, when it comes to power flows, for people to come into our offices and, be there with the equipment, with the native software, and within our security perimeter. Those are the kind of things we recommend during rate cases. And also just want to say that this level of data for analysis is getting into what sounds like a rate case to me. And so, I'm not sure what I would really want to understand why you need this level of data in order to comment on our distribution system plan. That's something I would really would want to understand better before we move forward in that conversation. So
it's fair. That's fair. Fair enough. And we're able to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, thanks. Two things. One, just in response to Ethan's point, I think ultimately we do want a list, but I don't think this is the time to do it. I think that the data related to, for example, hosting capacity or EVs or others will become clearer as we have those discussions. And so I think that it's inappropriate to try to put together a list now when we have a lot of work left to do. The second thing is we're focusing in this discussion on the utilities availability and potential availability of data. But earlier today, I just want to go back to this new concept of participation by more than the utilities in the development of the new distribution system that we're going to need. And it was mentioned this morning that there's substantial information that resides with the inverters on projects. That is not the utility, something the utilities access, but the project owners do access that data. And they have to have it, for example, for billing purposes if they're under a PPA. So we might also want to talk about what other sources of data might be available, and the Commission could in fact ask for those data to be made available.
All right. So it sounds like we don't want to get into the specifics. OPC, you guys have some kind of a peer review of utility solutions.
Right. So that's right, Judge. So what the bottom line with that exercise is to be able to get the necessary data to make an educated review of the solutions being presented. Currently, and it's not only in Maryland, there are several jurisdictions that when they come into a litigated proceeding, or they will show up results that are based on reports that are done by simulations that is a black box. We do not know engineering assumptions. We don't know how smart inverters are being modeled. So what we're seeking is an opportunity to look at how it is that they're modeling these systems that they're presenting the reports on. And I want to make it very clear, we have never, our intention is not to challenge the engineering judgment or the expertise of the utility engineers. These are licensed engineers, But what we are looking for is an opportunity to provide educated feedback to the presented solutions. They have, and I think we have spoken about reliability. They're charged with providing reliable service, and they do. What we're trying to ensure is that safe and reliable service is provided in the most cost-effective manner. So that's the goal behind the proposed approach.
Right, and you're talking about in the planning phases, not outside of a rate case, correct?
It will be during the planning it will be part of the planning process.
Right, okay.
So you want to challenge cost effectiveness when we propose our distribution system plan?
Well, right now, when you're presenting solutions, you're supposed to be presenting alternatives. What we want to be able is to make an educated, informed opinion of the presented solutions. And right now, Ethan, we cannot do it. I mean, you're just presenting results, and we don't know where these results are coming from. And listen, I mean, there are other, at the bulk power system, they perform something similar to it. What we're seeking is to understand how it is that you're reaching to those results. So we can, I think we also see this as a way to engender conversation, but without knowing how it is that you're doing this is very little that we can bring to the table on a technical basis, right? I mean, we could be part of all these stakeholder processes, and we can provide input, but if we want on a technical basis, being able to provide meaningful input, I think, and I'm gonna close it with this. I think the difference at this point is that now you have third-party developers that are not part of the utility that could bring utility functions onto the grid in a potential more cost-effective manner. And these are these are technical functions that have been put onto your grid. Absolutely, you are the ultimate responsible for the reliability of the grid. But if these folks do not understand technically how it is that you're doing these assumptions, I think you're crippling their ability to provide additional functionality that could be more cost effective.
I'm not really understanding. I feel like we have an interconnection process to integrate those third parties and their solutions into our system. We have a planning process to incorporate them. What you're describing sounds like somewhere between an RFP and a rate case. And I would need a lot more definition because, when I hear peer review, I hear the other utilities checking. So I was a little confused by that terminology. Utilities checking each other's plans, which I don't think would work either. Most of all, I just don't, where the line is that we have responsibility for the decisions on our system is going to be one we're going to have a lot of discussion around. And it sounds like where you're going is moving into a pre-rate case description, look into that. And we already have an MYP where we discuss out our future investments. So I'm struggling with this one, Jorge. I really am. And
I think I can comment on the process piece. To determine whether solutions and evaluation, and alternative evaluation is reasonable, we need more granular data than we're getting.
Okay, so you're going to, so you do want to evaluate the reasonableness of our investments before we've made them.
You can do that either through a planning process, but if it doesn't happen in the planning, it's got to happen somewhere. So as Jorge is presenting it, it can occur in the planning process.
Okay, what risk were you willing to take?
In the planning process,
what risk are you willing to take from us on that?
Let me jump
I
in
just
here.
want to know what risk you're willing to take.
They're not going to take
a very
any.
simple question.
No, they won't take any risk. I think and I've heard this referenced a few times throughout the process, and I think this goes into the transparency. And again, I'm not taking anybody's side. I think it goes to the transparency, and the stakeholders want to have a better idea of why you're doing project X. And okay, we understand why, we see the data. Have you considered doing, building an underground solar facility in the Chesapeake Bay? Something as an alternative. And then you say, yeah, we considered it, but we didn't do it because of X, Y, and Z. I don't think that anyone's trying to take over, at least I wouldn't anticipate them trying to take over, at least not successfully, or take on any risk from a utility rate case. I think they're just trying to get a better idea of how you came to your decision. Did you consider these alternatives? If so, why not?
Real quick, Judge. I just want, again, recognizing time, and we're trying to work through block one. The conversation here is about solutions, right? And we're talking about data sources that feed into projections.
Right.
And that's two different things, right? If we're trying to work through the J process map, this is a discussion for several meetings from now. I think we should bring the focus back to what data sources are going into the projection, which is, what this box is about.
Okay, that's fair.
And listen, here in regards to them, the multi-year plan is very hard to do. What we're proposing is to do it on the planning phase. So let's take this another day, but it's about being able to give you an educated opinion. From the get-go, you have to provide alternatives. From the get-go, you do. So it's very hard to provide you an educated opinion. And listen, Ethan, if you feel very strong about your solutions, you should welcome this level of scrutiny.
Well, let's tell you what, and I'm getting a lot of messages from my colleagues to keep things moving. But let's think of this as, perhaps we need, let's look at what we bring forward first as what we say our solutions are, our assumptions. And let's not just forego and say, oh, we need a possibly cyber secure website to download all the data in the world from. Let's evolve towards that kind of conversation before we immediately jump there. Let's see what perhaps I can put forward solutions and explanations to you that you accept at face value with the data we can give you.
Let me jump in and to follow up on Jacob. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds. I'm probably guilty of doing it this time. I don't know that we've actually decided anything. I think the utilities have said, we'll give you the data that we have if you can tell us what you want and why you need it. And we got OPC saying, I need a platform to access, everything that you have. I mean, and if we disagree on that, that's fine. I just don't know if we've actually accomplished anything on this particular bullet.
You may have summed up the non-consensus well.
And I'm fine with that. And, we can always revisit it down the road. Eric.
Yes, just an inquiring question here, right? And we struggle with these things here in the utilities too, on how we deal with transformation and change. It seems as if there may be an opportunity here where we adopt a crawl, walk, run methodology as we go through this journey. Do we have to land our first iteration through this and getting the process going? Do we have to land in a spot where we ultimately may want to be, or in interest of time and being able to get a process out, is let's do sort of a minimum viable approach that we can start kicking the tires, right, with the understanding that we can iterate and improve on the process later. Just trying to see if that's an approach that we can adopt in the working group, because we've seen that if you need a car and you're trying to get a BMW and you work in McDonald's, maybe a Toyota Corolla is the way to go, just to use an analogy, right, to get a car to move around, or else you'll never get out of the starting blocks, right? Just curious if my my colleagues Jorge and Eli and others can you know, adopt in a crawl, walk, run approach, because if we try to sprint, we may pull a muscle.
I hear you, Eric, but then we need to, I think, define the end state. And, you know, we're heading towards that end state through that approach. That I think that could be something to talk about. We hear you. It's not going to happen overnight. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that feedback.
All right. All right. I think with that said, you know, we've agreed to disagree on this one, and we can always revisit it down the road. All right, moving on. Already approved resource retirements and additions. At the conclusion of the last meeting, I think we had all agreed that we didn't need this, but then staff provided a presentation that Delegate Charkoudian made regarding capacity interconnection rights, transfer reform, and I believe OPC indicated it should be reflected in the DSP, but it shouldn't be a lever. Therefore, we didn't need to modify anything. Anybody want to weigh in on whether we should keep this in here, or do we still think it's not needed?
To clarify OPC's position, I think we're getting at that it should maintain within the box, I guess, as an input into DSP.
Okay.
So it should stick, but it's not. It's not like a scenario based function, right? Where we're making different assumptions based on different possible futures of resource retirements. We're just saying it's important to reflect planned resource retirements and additions as an input into DSP processes.
Okay. All right. So OPC wants to keep it. Anybody? All right. Julia, NEA agrees. Mr. Bartlett agrees. Mr. Verchinsky, this was, I don't want to say your baby, but you had suggested dropping it.
Yes, I did. I still don't think that that's something that should be included, namely because this is a transmission issue and not a distribution planning issue. If you have generator retirements, which has been brought up because of Brandon Shores, that is a PJM issue. That is not, in my opinion, an issue for Maryland to be dealing with. Yeah, we have to be cognizant of it. Well, how does that change the planning process? I'm yet to be convinced.
Okay, that's fair. Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, just in response to Paul's question, and I think that, you know, these retirements can be seen fairly far out, although they've moved the timeline on Brendan Shores and Wagner. But part of the response really needs to be thinking about the options that will replace the lost capacity. And in many cases, that can involve things like increased amounts of distributed energy generation in the utilities region. It can involve things like development of virtual power plan. And those are distribution system considerations. If you talk about those things, then the planning, the thinking would have to involve, is the distribution system capable of supporting those changes? And so it does intersect partly specifically case by case. And so I agree with what Eli said, is that this doesn't have to be something that is built into the scenario process, but it is something that we should all be looking at, and the utility should be looking at in advance, which is something we all didn't exactly do with Brendan Shores.
Thank you, sir. Ethan, I see you're up.
I always defer to my capacity planner.
I thought you were going to say that. Eric?
Judge, don't let him get away with that, please. It's his turn.
Darn it, Eric. Just, you know, we don't have a lot of levers when it comes to these kinds of things because we're a deregulated utility. And, right now we don't have the ability to do much even to create more opportunities for solar interconnection. We have what we have. And, that's why we agree with Paul Verchinsky. This is outside the scope of this. We definitely have integrated distribution and transmission planning in our companies. We, work with both PJM and our greater transmission group to make sure that our distribution and transmission systems integrate properly. But at the end of the day, we are price takers at the we're price takers at the PJM market. We purchase on behalf of our customers. We don't have any access to generation of our own. We're not even allowed to own solar for the purposes of sale to customers. That's just not a lot of levers. And so I guess I would ask, if you really believe that we should be including the bulk transmission system, then you need to tell us what it is you want to see from that interaction beyond what we already do.
Well, I guess to go to Mr. Bartlett's point, say Brandon Shores, Brandon Shores is closing in 2035. How do you incorporate that into your plan, if at all?
We've been a part of the discussions at PJM, and so is the commission, and so is OPC, and they've and at FERC, and that's the level it happens at. We know that there will be. We've been a part of the planning for a new transmission line, and that's where we can go.
Right, but I guess in terms of so I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to make sure I understand. So a power plant's retiring, that doesn't change things on the distribution level from a planning perspective. Is that, in a nutshell, what you're saying?
Not much that I know of. I mean,
okay.
if people would like for us to build an Empire State Building sized battery storage project, I would love to talk about funding that.
I like it. You got a spot?
I do not. Real estate is always the first question when it comes to siting battery storage.
They're knocking down the pavilions. All right, a couple hands up. Joyce and then Eric.
Ethan, I think you just answered the question, but that was my question. So a transmission upgrade, for whatever reason at the PJM doesn't necessarily impact your distribution system, is what you're saying, such that it needs to be incorporated? That was my first question. Then I have another one. I'll ask the other one.
I'm reading a couple of messages that people are sending me.
So that I think you answered it. I was just kind of looking over at California.
And I'm getting responses that people that no impacts on our distribution system are seen from the Brandon Shores.
Okay. And then I guess in terms of transmission planning, we don't know that, right? I mean, so the information that you just gave, and I think having it included is so that all the stakeholders are like, oh yeah, that's not going to have an distribution on an impact on our distribution utilities. We can move on. And then the second one is the reverse power flow from DERs. Is that also just a non-issue for transmission planners? That's not really for us, but I guess those are the two things that I was thinking of in terms of that and why I wanted that information in.
When we get to the bidirectional, I think that's a time to have that discussion, but just the transmission and the distribution system are different when it comes to bidirectional flows, is where I'd like to leave that right now, and so we don't go down another rabbit hole.
All right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bartlett and then Eric.
Actually, Eric was first.
Okay.
Thank you. Just wanted to piggyback a little bit on the comments Ethan made, and just to provide some insight. So our transmission planning team at Exelon are the ones who interact with PJM, right? All the transmission models and studies are done with our transmission planning and analysis team, and all those scenarios are looked at from a PJM lens. If there is something that is identified, right? That may impact or the distribution system may be able to help with. There is always conversations we're having between the two planning teams, right? So there are conversations that are being had. When Brandon Shores came up as being retired, we put a team together to have some discussions around that. What are the possible impacts? What can we do, right? And typically, when you see large retirements of this sort on the T side, it's not something you can fulfill very easily with DERs and batteries on the distribution side, right? It's a large generation that needs to be filled, especially within that area. So just to respond, there is collaboration between the distribution system and the transmission systems, but these are usually identified and initiated between the transmission and PJM. What we have experienced so far is that retirement to these stations, right, are typically on the T side, right, and has minimal impact on the D side.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Bartlett.
Hope
Oh, I'm
that-
sorry, Eric, are you done?
Yes, just hope that provided some clarity.
Okay.
Yeah, just to say, yeah, I understand that that bulk power is a transmission issue. However, and maybe it goes back to what I think of as the evolving nature of the partnership between the utilities, local governments, state government agencies like MEA, and developers or investors. And maybe it's a little kumbaya, but I actually think it's the way it's going to have to be, which is that as we look, as we understand that such retirements are going to happen, we can look in advance at what the options are for making up the gap, but also, and in general, these coal-fired plants have only been run as peakers intermittently anyway. So some of the options that would need to be considered, that would need to be discussed, would involve assets that would be developed at the level of the distribution system. And that consideration to have the utilities in the discussion, to have the state and local government and the planners, the Department of Planning in the discussion, to look at options to assure reliability, ensure capacity, and at the same time move us towards where we need to be. That process can and should happen, and that would involve the utilities to the extent that some of the solutions would require involvement of the distribution system and potentially modifications and hosting capacity, whatever. And that's all that's the only point I want to make. I just don't see it as being I understand that it's a bulk issue. Actually, if PJM wasn't so stuck, there were 270 megawatts of storage capacity. They could provide that peaker function, but they're stuck. But in terms of thinking of these retirements as potentially providing, if you will, opportunities for going through some of the changes that we need to go through, and that would involve the distribution system. I just don't want us to lose that possibility and just get into, again, the IT, the transmission and distribution difference is important, but the distribution system could be involved.
All right, thank you, sir. Anybody else want to be heard? Looks like a couple different points of view. It doesn't sound like we're going to be able to agree on it, which is fine. All right. Next one, market prices. Again, this is a disagreement. Utilities, kind of Ethan already said it a little bit. There's little, if any, influence on wholesale prices, whereas OPC wants utilities to include market prices, or maybe investigate market prices or include market prices in your planning?
Hi, I guess I'll take there's my camera. I'll take the reins here. Yes, we just we don't see how we can, no levers to pull there. Even our acquisitions function, because they have an annual auction they attend, there really isn't anything they can do there. If OPC has some thoughts about how we could, happy to entertain those, but on the table right now, we don't know how we would do that, so.
Yeah, I'm happy to offer a thought, Ethan. Thanks. And you would certainly be interested in hearing from, maybe the forecast folks who probably have some of this more detailed expertise. But the way that we were thinking about it is in, let's go back to the longer term, let's go back to the scenarios that we were discussing, the various sensitivities. And one of those, for example, being a CSNA case, right? That was the number 2 scenario that we had discussed earlier. So the idea being of perhaps under that forecasted scenario, if that scenario were to come to fruition, would that have a potential impact on market prices? And so this is ultimately a question for a forecaster. I don't know the answer off the bat, right? It certainly may not. But I wonder if you can kind of extrapolate impacts of, if we are achieving these types of, these types of DER deployments, if we are achieving these types of GHG reductions, and those assumed impacts can also be extrapolated more broadly, does that have an impact on market pricing? And I would be curious if it does. Admittedly, I'm not certain whether it does, but it could be a component of a CSNA based scenario analysis could explore.
Let me ask first, are you an economist too?
I am not.
Okay, you sound like one of us. All right. I too am interested in the impact of market price, especially of increasing integration of DERs. But at the end of the day, that's not going to impact our distribution system planning. We're still going, all we want to do is implement the CSNA goals. Happy to work towards getting us to net zero by 2045. That's definitely going to impact the amount of wholesale market we purchase, but okay, we still need to have a distribution grid that can match what our customers are doing. So at the end of the day, we're going to be planning for that, not what's going on at PJM. It's the difference between distribution and transmission. So while I share your curiosity, I don't see how it will impact the goals of this group.
And I think to add to what Ethan was saying, Eli, I think kind of what you're describing sounds more like an input into the scenario analysis that we were talking about before, more so than into the distribution system planning.
That's right. That was sort of how I was at least thinking about it. But I mean, the scenario analysis is a part of distribution system planning.
And if I could give you just maybe an example where your load forecast could be impacted by natural gas prices, right? How fast is electrification going to occur is partly determined by the price of the substitute, and those types of issues can be and are in other jurisdictions integrated into scenario analysis that's looking at electric and gas coordinated planning. So just an example of one way that market prices could be relevant.
And just to add to that, what Eli and Ronald are saying is that it's not, a direct impact that you need to be thinking about, and it's part of what operations as a distribution company you need to use. It's going to influence, what will be the scenario. It's part of the scenario design. And another example besides gas prices would be if there were, wholesale prices started going up, then you now have higher retail prices. That may influence how many people will put in, rooftop solar or put in storage. So it's an impact. It's information. That's part of the scenario development. It's not, a direct, input.
David put it much more eloquently than I did.
All right. So I think I may understand it. So Jacob, Ethan, are you okay with considering it more, again, as an input to the scenarios we discussed rather than a standalone issue?
I think we need to take that back. There's been a lot of new ideas put on the table.
Okay.
Could this be one that's crawl, walk, run also?
Could it be what? I'm sorry, sir.
Just one of the concepts where we look at it from a crawl, walk, run perspective, that, you know, that's a later thought, not something we would come out of the gate trying to put some solutioning around.
Yeah, I don't, Dave.
Yeah, you know, I think we're getting into biting off a little bit more than we can chew, because there's a lot of factors that are going to go into economy situations that are going to impact the adoption of DERs. You know, you could get into electric vehicle, you know, battery prices, you can get into gasoline prices, you can get into a whole host of factors that's going to impact the adoption of electric vehicles. And the same is true for solar and battery storage, DERs in general. And are we really trying to get into the weeds and trying to predict what's going to happen rather than just trying to assume a given adoption rate and go with that? And those adoption rates are going to change. They're going to be a swing one way or the other based on given market conditions at the time. But you're getting into a whole new level of trying to predict the rates of adoption of certain things. It's going to we're going to be spinning in circles.
Part of the scenario analyses will have to assume adoption levels, though. So just thinking about how you create the different scenarios and adoption levels would be, you know, a consideration of the price. And you can go down into a dark hole, but there's also, you know, ways to just determine that most of the variation in adoption is determined by, for example, gas prices and electricity prices.
And, you know, Ron, Eli, I want you to take something away, because right now what I'm struggling with is whether we're doing a forecast, a scenario analysis. Are we saying ceteris paribus versus this stated goal, or are we actually trying to do a forecast based on, you know, I think we need to have a little more, not today, definitely, but a little more discussion about what scenarios, what our purpose is. Are we trying to create this is a target, as if all of these things happen? Are we looking at what what we are seeing based on all of these deep inputs like market prices? These are very different analysis we'd be doing. And so, you know, we're only going to do 3, so let's be careful, maybe around 3. Let's be careful how we define these, but not for today.
To piggyback on Ethan's comments, right, and trying to get out of the gate. If it's adoption that is input into the distribution system planning process, right? Could we leave it at that input? Whatever needs to be done from a market and analysis, right? That is something that is happening in a totally different process, a totally different effort that creates the feed in from what is the adoption rate we're seeing that goes into our planning process. And if we can align on that, then I think we can remove the market pricing from the discussion, because the more we add these complex thoughts to the discussion and to the process, it's going to be harder and harder for us to get out of the gate.
All right. I think we've kind of beat this horse to death a bit. Ethan, I think you were going to, why don't you and Eli and Ronald and Jacob see if you guys can get on the same page as to what you're envisioning in terms of scenario and whether or not this market prices factor can even be factored in. But for now, we'll just leave it as a non-consensus, and you can give us an update as to where you are at our next meeting or whenever you have a chance to hash that out. All right. Okay. Last bullet is resource costs and capabilities. Seems like it's kind of general. Of note, Mr. Verchinsky was recommending that the utilities IT software costs be brought in-house and not subcontracted. I think at least for the modeling of management and modeling of DERs, OPC recommended we start looking at what a bidirectional system will look like.
This is Paul Verchinsky.
Yes, sir.
I put those out because I'm concerned about core competencies for the utilities, and IT and managing things digitally needs to be in-house. I have no idea what they currently do within house. What I have seen, and this is basically on the billing end, is that it's been horrible.
Okay.
And if it's horrible on the billing end, it's going to be horrible on other ends. So that's where I'm coming from. Admittedly, a very narrow focus and experience, but I have no idea what they're doing on the IT side. I've seen some very massive issues when it comes to deployment of EVSEs and their monitoring of what's going on there. It's been basically left to subcontractors, and that has not been a good outcome. So that's my level of what I've seen here and why I said what I did.
All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Utilities want to respond. I mean, you guys do your IT stuff in-house.
I will not be responding to anything regarding billing. But IT tends to, in my experience, and could be limited to me, other members of our team may have other experiences, we don't have everything in-house at the beginning when we're moving into new areas. So first we have to contract out and we begin to move those capabilities inside. And so, there's always an initial stage where we're dealing with new technology and we have to go to companies that specialize in it. But yeah, not talking to billing at all. Nope.
Okay. All right.
This is Dave from PE. I'll just throw in, at this point, we can't comment on what we're going to do in-house and what we're not going to do. We can't commit to anything there.
Okay. Yeah. Wasn't necessarily looking for just a wag on it. I'm guessing my thought would probably be the utilities don't want to be restricted in what they can and can't do with outside contractors.
Agreed.
All right. Anybody else want to weigh in on this? OPC, you guys were the only other ones who submitted any comments on this item.
And sorry, Judge, can you restate the item?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's the last one. Didn't get a ton of comments. Resource costs and capabilities.
I'm looking at our reply comments, so I got to pull up our initial.
Sure. Yeah. I just have a brief. You recommended utilities and stakeholders begin to determine what a bidirectional system looks like. Incorporate planning for export into DSP and smart inverter functionality.
Got it. And I think that will largely come into place down the line, largely in like the DER and EV forecast discussions. But I think part of the general gist that we're trying to get at with that is that, smart inverters in general are, essentially starting to provide additional capabilities to DERs that will allow DERs to provide services to the grid that need to be, increasingly incorporated into the way that utilities plan the grid. If they can better plan for these soon to, be enabled capabilities of DERs to provide various grid services, those services can be better accounted for in terms of distribution system planning, and therefore might change the the status quo of how the system is planned if utilities can basically better factor in smart inverter based DER capabilities.
And those capabilities, they need to be modeled correctly. That is very important that all that functionality is captured in the model and be understood into how it is that they're supporting the grid.
And then finally, just on the IT piece, I just note that the computational needs on the distribution system are likely to increase pretty exponentially, and that a lot of utilities are looking to cloud-based solutions. I think talking about IT generally is really broad, so I don't think we would want to be pinning the solution to anything specific, other than ensuring that the available options are being priced and there's an appropriate process for whatever determinations being made.
All right. Anybody else want to be heard on this one? It seems like, I mean, I don't want to say we agree, but there's certainly no disagreement. I guess we keep it, and I'll just throw in everyone's comments. Anyone? All right. So that is the last bullet for block one. All right. So now let's talk about, block one. Yeah, it only took us 5 meetings. I saw your little thing there, Ethan. All right, let me share my screen. That's it. All right, let's do, where is my vision statement? All right, hold on. I got to share the vision statement here. No. Why is this so hard? There it is. All right, can you guys see the screen there?
Yes.
All right, okay. All right, so we've got, we went from two options to essentially 3. Oh no, stop. All right, this isn't working. Let me just make this big. All right, so we've got the joint utilities version. We've got staff's original and then staff's amended version of staff 2. So it seems like there was a lot more support for OPC's version than any other one.
Chuck, it's not showing up on the screens.
All right, sorry about that. My apologies. All right, how about that? You guys got it?
Can see it now.
Okay, all right. So, we got, like I said, we got 3 versions, staff's second version, OPC's edited version, and then the joint utilities version. A lot more support for the second one, or for OPC's version of staff's. Any impressions, feedback? Just want to arm wrestle over it?
I like OPC's version.
All right. I thought you might, Eli. I'm assuming that was Eli. I can't.
Yeah, I just figured I'd kick off the conversation.
All right.
Just a quick question, because bear with me, the product management piece of me, that hat, when we use words like shall, should, and may, means something specific to me, right? And I see the word shall the utilities shall provide safe, reliable, and affordable service through the use of distribution system planning process. That is telling me that there's no other way that we should be able to do those things. A bit concerned that this process is the only path for us to get our job done.
All right, so how about will? It's not shall, but it's a step down. I know we've had this conversation off and on as to what those words should be. All right, just keep in mind, this is all that's standing in between us and the end of the meeting.
I would just, the word optimizes for DERs, I mean, we can incorporate, but, you know, we're half of any DER project. So, and I don't know that we want to take on the responsibility for optimizing somebody else's project.
Okay.
The only other thing I'll note, just for consistency, is in the beginning it says includes transparent stakeholder participation, and then it also says at the bottom incorporate robust stakeholder engagement. So just either match the language or delete one of them for consistency.
About robust and transparent. No, I'm teasing. I know we talked about that. Transparent specifically referenced in the statute. I think that's why it's been included in some versions. So, well, are the utilities, again, I don't think you're going to be taken to task. I mean, I wouldn't imagine that you'd be taken to task if for some reason, I mean, this is a vision. It's not a mandate. So if we were to take out optimizes and we'll just make that make that a different color. All right, and then if we want to change shall to shall continue to provide. What's the other one say? Well, the first one that we had was shall continue to maintain the grid. So maybe is shall that big of a deal here? I mean, it pretty much kind of says the same thing.
That's different when it say we shall maintain the grid, right? What we're saying here is that we shall do that through and that's the piece that.
All right, whoever raised their hand, just go ahead and speak after Eric because I can't see you.
Yeah, this is DeAndre. I am in favor of us keeping optimized because the idea is to leverage distributed energy resources and non-wire solutions in order to get a certain outcome. And if they're not leveraged correctly, then there's no optimization. And utilities have the ability to assign what utilities are currently submitting their smart inverter profile settings, which based on the settings that they set will in fact can optimize distributed energy resources that interconnect to their systems. So I think utilities have the ability to optimize these alternatives and these resources. That's my argument.
Okay.
I know the time we're at, and knowing this is a vision statement, I really don't want to fight it, but I would, I can optimize a non-wire solution I own. I'm not sure I can optimize a third-party owned operated device even with some view into it. But,
Ethan,
if
I
it's
think
what
you're
it takes to get to the
operational, though, and we're talking about planning. So it's optimization with respect to planning. Right. And you're talking, it seems like what you're referring to is optimization operationally. Is that accurate?
Optimization in regards to planning, right? How the utility can leverage these resources to in regards to its electric grid
Yes, exactly.
services, in regards to grid services and system upgrades, hosting capacity. These are we're looking to try to set smart inverter settings that will optimize hosting capacity and grid services and stability of the grid. So it's not necessarily controlling what the resource is doing, but more so how you can leverage how you're leveraging or optimizing the potential of that resource to the better or the good of the electric grid.
Exactly. And you don't need to own it or operate it to optimize it into planning.
Okay, we'll concede the point because it's the end of the day. But
You beat him into submission. Okay, so all right, so that's back in. All right. So other than that, are the utilities amendable to this version?
as long as safe, reliable, and affordable is at the beginning, we're pretty okay.
All right. Well, then, this is what it's going to be then. All right. Okay. Mr. Bartlett.
Yeah, Judge, Your Honor, just as we're closing, I did take a minute to look at case 9618, and I'm trying to figure out what item represents the report that you're talking about. There's item 16 is a 2019 report that looks pretty similar, but it is 2019. And then item 50 is a supplemental report in 2023. It looked like you might be referring to item 6 to the 2019 supplemental report, which is called.
I thought there's an interim report. Did I give you the wrong one?
You didn't specify, but so there's the interim report.
I think it should be implementation report. I think that 2019 was the one I was talking about, but then there is a second report that was the second phase of that work group.
Okay, so the implementation report. Okay, yeah, that's item
I believe it was 16. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw those references in an email. I think, and the other one might be 37, and then there was another work group report I did in the Empower docket. I can throw that out as well.
Wow, a lot of work. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I think we at least accomplished some stuff today. I will send out a recap of kind of where things stand in terms of block 1. As much as I would like to take on multiple blocks next time, I think Eric had said something earlier that it might be beneficial to kind of do like a color-coded approach here. So for the 16th, maybe do goals and objectives. And then for the following meetings, we do DER forecast and load forecast together. I'm happy to mix them up, but it seems like it might be more beneficial to do goals and then do the DER and load forecast together. All right.
Sounds good.
All right. So, looking ahead, we'll meet again on the 16th, same time. Again, if you have comments, suggestions, I'm sure a lot of folks will, on what we should be talking about, why it should be included, circulate those on the 9th. And then if you have reply comments to the comment on the 9th, please submit those by the 14th. Okay? All right.
Thanks so much, Judge.
All right. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Just one question. You referenced the next one after the 16th.
Yes, sir.
What would be the date for that one?
I'm thinking the 30th, sir.
All right. Thank you.
We might have to restrain or comments might have to come in a little sooner or maybe later. I don't know what everyone's Thanksgiving schedules are, but we can figure that out. And then, yeah, so.
All right. Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks
sir.
for all your work, Judge.
Well, thanks for the input today. Hopefully we can get, moving a little quicker. Jacob, I appreciate you being the weed master. And I guess we'll see everybody in a couple weeks.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.